Because this week is a glass week. Clearly, it was time to call out the volcano resources of the National Park Service. This is only partly cheating in the timeline. Because while the volcanoes I'll be pointing you at aren't in the America that was in the first half of the 19th century, they were in areas where people from the current America were traveling across or by or to in search of land to occupy or minerals to dig up. By the way, around volcanoes, old volcanoes, is a great place to look for mineral deposits, since one of the main things volcanoes do, besides mass destruction and disruption, is bring up goodies from underneath the Earth's very outer skin. Sort of a popped pimple of geological wonders. Anyway, I'd like to draw your attention to the Obsidian Dome in June Lake, California, inside the Inyo National Forest in southeastern California. The Obsidian Dome is a pile of volcanic glass that was pushed up out of the earth a little under 700 years ago, right around when the bubonic plague was having its best run in Europe. Entire boulders of shiny black glass are just sitting there in this dry forest environment waiting to boggle your mind. This is admittedly a difficult place to get to, but on the other hand, people go visit Death Valley all the time, and this is right next to that park. Other obsidian troves you can visit include an obsidian eruption in Valle Caldera in New Mexico and a mind-boggling 98-foot or 30-meter tall obsidian cliff in Yellowstone Park. These were all used by locals as material sources before the arrival of Europeans, for weapons and ornaments that have been found all over the continent. Just like the jade and copper items that were traded along routes from South America, this volcanic glass found its way around as well. So if you're looking for something truly amazing, go hunt down a pile of volcanic glass at a volcano near you. Just ask the nps.gov website which one is closest to you. Episode 117, The History of Glass, Mostly Translucent. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the glass of the past. All this food research has made me into something of a glass fan, and finally, we're to the point in history where food and glass start to interact. But before we get to food and glass in the 1800s, this week, I get to drag you through the truly fascinating history of glass, with a little chemistry thrown in. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that for most of the time people have making and working with glass, it has not been transparent, but only translucent, the kind where you can see light shining through it, but you cannot see through the glass to what's on the other side. And this happens for several reasons. One is that there are heterogeneous impurities like undissolved chunks of something, such as non-glass solids or bubbles of air, keeping the light from going through in straight lines. Or the surface is scratched and pitted so much the light cannot transmit through it. Think frosted glass. A second cause is high concentrations of minerals dissolved in the glass that block the transmission of an image. Of course, the most common reason for translucence over transparence is a little from column A and a little from column B. The very first glass that people worked with was all translucent, highly pigmented glass, and it was naturally occurring glass, not human manufactured glass. Wait, what? You say glass occurs naturally? Okay, I kind of gave that away in my National Park Service bit, but yes, the first glass that humans used was the naturally occurring glass spit out by volcanoes. Known in multitudinous places around the globe and used for all sorts of things that required sharp cutting and reflection, volcanic glass was given the name obsidian by Pliny the Elder. A sample of the stuff was brought to his attention in the 1st century CE by an explorer who went by the name of Obsidius, following a journey to the East African region the Romans had termed Ethiopia. All glass, volcanic or human manufactured, has some important things in common. The big thing is that their main component is silica, SiO2, or a compound of silicon and oxygen. You've likely interacted with it and maybe even ingested a bit as sand. And if you have a certain familiarity with the Simpsons TV show, a sound cue goes here.
Think where we'd be without sand. Sand, sand, sand.
But sand alone does not make glass. Left to its own devices in underground conditions, silica makes crystalline or rock quartz. This shows up as 6-sided crystal columns and the shiny bits in granite and mixed into all manner of other metamorphic rock. But when silica gets into the volcano business, because it is made of a pretty light set of atoms that make up a light mineral, it tends to float to the top when it gets melted. As the foamy top of lava, it mixes with other low-density minerals like calcium and sodium and potassium. The tendency of these atoms to shed electrons causes the resulting mixture of silica and the positive ions to disrupt attempts at a crystal structure. So when cooling happens at just the right speed, the amorphous solid we know as glass forms. Most obsidian has a black, brown, or green appearance from the metal ions it takes up. Black obsidian, the most common, is the result of iron oxide contamination, which makes sense since pretty much the rest of the earth that isn't silicon is iron. Okay, nickel too, but it doesn't play the right way to dye glass. The thing that makes glass glass is that even in its solid form, it is a chaotic, amorphous, non-crystalline solid. When it's melted, it can be stretched and shaped in infinite ways, and yet somehow can be and stay translucent, and under the right conditions, transparent. This amorphous quality actually led to a mistaken conclusion for a decade or so. A hypothesis was proposed that glass, even when it appeared solid at human-friendly temperatures, was actually still flowing, even if ever so slowly. It was still behaving as a liquid, just a very, very slow one. This resulted from the observation that when one looked at glass panes from 100 or 200 or 300 or even 400 years ago, and that's about the limit of most residential glass window panes, by the way, it was observed that the bottom edge was usually the thickest part. An untested conclusion was that the glass, over the centuries, was slowly flowing to the bottom of the pane. However, since archaeologists are scientists, some testing was brought in. If this were really happening, then the same glass from the same source of the same age installed in the same locations should flow at similar rates. So after lots of work with micrometers and the examination of many, many, many little square panes of glass in European cities not interesting enough to be bombed in World War II, the conclusion was reached that the glass was in fact not flowing. It turns out that glaziers simply put the thickest bit at the bottom when they were building windows. I will still run across the "it actually is flowing" assertion on occasion, because it's one of those facts that's fun and seems to make sense upon first glance. But a big part of the counterproof that glass stays put came from decorative windows where shaped pieces had to go in particular orientations to make the desired pattern. And it turned out that even after 800 years in stained glass windows, the thick edge remained on top. Okay, so it has been suitably established. After glass anneals, that is, cools to a solid, it stays where you left it. So what is glass made of when humans make it? How did they start making it? What were the first glass things humans made? Why is old glass usually greenish or brownish or yellowish or sometimes blue? And how did they figure out how to make it clear? And what glass stuff did we make before we made windows? And how were windows made before the 19th century? Well, glad you asked. Let's go. All the glass I'm talking about is pre-21st century glass. So the frankly cool super materials they're coming up with these days that I have very little knowledge of might work differently. But everything that comes before shatterproof glass works on the principles I'm laying down here. All glass is mainly silica mixed with a carbonate salt and a light metal oxide. The most common formula from the beginning of glass manufacture is silica plus sodium or potassium carbonate, often known generally as sodas, think baking soda, and calcium oxide, generally known as lime. As a result, the majority of glass could be classed as soda-lime glass. Pure silica glass or fused quartz can be made, but it requires very high temperatures and is hard to work with. The carbonate and lime added to the regular glass acts as fluxes. Generally in glass, ceramics, and metals, fluxes are additives that lower the melting point of the pure substance and make it more workable. Other chemicals can be added in, accidentally or on purpose, that color the glass or make it more transparent, more resistant to thermal shock, or more resistant to scratching, and so on. How humans came up with the idea to make glass is mostly a mystery. We can definitely come up with some reasonable hypotheses, but the technology of making things like pottery and metal and glass and carvings and such came a long time before the technology of writing was pursued. And even after many systems of writing had been developed, the habit of explaining ourselves and writing down detailed instructions was still far in the future. And technology knowledge was a thing that tended to get passed on personally. Explanations in writing of how something was figured out and how to do it, that's a philosophical stance not taken up by the people developing these early technologies. The oldest examples of human manufactured glass come from that region responsible for so many human innovations, the Levant, or that backward C curve of the inside of the Mediterranean Sea, and specifically along the coast of what is now Syria, Lebanon, and northern Egypt. The coast part is important because that's where the right sand is. The region is also known for early metallurgy, so they were already big into things that required hot fires. So one of my best guesses about how glass happened, it has to do with human fascination with fire, and in the absence of the entertainments developed in the intervening 5,000 years or so, there was a lot of playing about with, so what happens when we get this really, really hot? A certain amount of luck came in here, as it just so happens that much of the sand in this coastal region is impregnated with necessary sodium salts, often called natron, and seashells, a good source of calcium oxide, both essential ingredients for soda-lime glass. Over time, the ingredients were worked out, and so if the sand didn't come with enough natron on its own, coastal halophyte plants, that is, plants that incorporate sea salts into their structure, could be burned to produce ashes that provided the required sodium carbonate. However it happened, over time, the favorable ratios of different materials were developed, along with methods of heating ever larger amounts of glass. By around 2000 BCE, the technology of the reverberatory or tank furnace had been developed, which was capable of melting tons of glass at once. A 9-ton slab of glass uncovered at an archaeological site in the 1940s from around this era made glass archaeologists completely recalibrate the sheer volume of glass they thought was being made and the extent of the glass trade. Studies of old glass manufacturing sites and the compounds found in old glass have led researchers to speculate that glass production came out of observations made during the development of metal refining and smelting. In fact, early writings and communications about glass can refer to the mass of hot raw glass as a metal. Since many of the temperatures and chemical mixing considerations can be similar, along with the viscosity of the melted material and the need to cool each of them in certain ways to obtain desirable characteristics, early classification of glass this way makes a certain amount of sense. Obviously, over time, glass and metal manufacture have diverged, but occasionally you'll run across places where they share vocabulary, as in the word flux. The earliest glassed objects made by humans were obviously chipped, carved, and polished volcanic glass. All soda-lime glasses, volcanic or human manufactured, will break with a beveled or conical edge. Careful chipping or knapping can produce extremely thin, sharp blades, even thinner and sharper, but clearly less durable than any metal blades. In regions where obsidian was plentiful, it's common to see obsidian arrowheads, daggers, and other bladed weapons. The Mayans had a rather terrifying polearm or spear-type weapon called a tepoztopili, which was a long pole with a hard wood head that had glass blades embedded along the edges with tree resins or bitumen adhesives. And many South American and South Pacific societies share a sort of sword or club design with stone, tooth, or glass blades embedded in a wooden base. The South American glass-bladed version is generally known as the macahuito. All of them look very yikes. Decorative objects were also carved out of obsidian, including glass mirrors made by laborious polishing. Manufactured glass was also polished and carved. These techniques are known generally as cold shaping. Another early use of glass was to regrind it and melt it into faience decorations, a precursor of enamel. The first decorative glass objects that were hot-shaped were beads. Then it was small pieces of glass pulled and twirled and put together. If you ever see a glass shaper making little glass unicorns and birds and decorative curlicues over a blowtorch at a street fair or such, that's the idea. Next came the glass canes that have a picture or pattern made out of thin strings of glass that reveals itself as slices are cut and show intricately patterned beads or plaques. These sliced beads are an art form of the earliest type that has survived into the modern age. Once glass pulling had been developed far enough, the hollow core vessel was next. A flammable shape was made and then hot glass was placed around the core. These core-formed vessels, vases, bottles, and so on, were the last step before glass blowing was figured out. However, during this time, very elaborate core-formed objects were produced. Often the glass that went over the core had been built up out of multiple strips of colored glass, giving the final object a striped appearance. Or the object was reheated and decorative glass would be embedded or stuck to the core-formed object. Again, at this point, all the glass is highly colored or cloudy with bubbles and impurities. The pulling of glass strands is giving people ideas, but another invention, metal pipes, had to come first. With the invention of the metal pipe, glass blowing was now possible, and it was the Romans, with their affection for plumbing, who seemed to have cracked the code and really developed the art of glass blowing. The result was thinner glass items that could be shaped and decorated ever more elaborately. Blown shapes could have other strings and plaques stuck onto them. A mosaic style where reheated blown glass objects were rolled in colored chips of glass and then formed until the surface was smooth was a popular then and still surviving style now. Strings of glass could also be attached for textured designs or pulled through to get scallop shapes now familiar in cake icing and latte art. Again, an art glass style you'll still see today. From there, mold blowing developed. A fire-resistant mold would have a bubble of glass blown into it. When properly cooled, the mold could be removed to reveal an elaborate design. No carving necessary. However, lots of carving still went on. The most famous and elaborate form of this was cameo glass. These are items where a sandwich of glass, typically an opaque white top and a dark underlayer, are made and cooled. The resulting object is then carved, leaving the white glass to be a scene that uses the underlying dark glass as shadows in the revealed three-dimensional design. One of the most famous pieces is a Roman cameo vase. It is generally believed that the sandwich glass was shaped into a vase and then the cameo scene was carved from that. It's truly a remarkable piece of art. As carving and coloring glass became more skillful and repeatable, so did the perfecting of formulas for heating and the chemical regimens that would produce glass that approached clear and colorless. Most of the sand used as a base had some mineral components. Just as with volcanic glass, stray iron and manganese oxides all over the place would mix in with the sand and usually give the glass a greenish or brownish cast. Over time, combinations of other chemicals were found that could make glass colorless, but these were usually only bothered with in the most expensive items. Common things like bottle containers and regular window glasses would always have a color, and some clear glasses, as they age, the chemicals within will take on colors through long water and air exposure. In fact, water will hydrate glass slowly over time and under pressure. The potting medium perlite is actually very ancient volcanic glass that has been largely hydrated. I had always thought of perlite as a manufactured product, but no. It is mined and used in a large array of applications where chemical resistance is needed, along with a large surface area. Because it is not and cannot be a crystal, it is classified as a mineraloid, which is fitting since one of its majority atoms, silicon, falls into that odd classification of metalloid on the periodic table. Because the home of glass manufacture happens to overlap with much of what Europe called the Holy Land for hundreds of years, the colored glass of the region became tied up into the religious symbolism of Europe. The more and less violent visitations made by Europeans to the Levant often coincided with the bringing back of vibrantly colored pieces of glass that would be incorporated into religious objects. Eventually, glass technology and expertise were imported into Europe and recreated with local artisans that blossomed not only into the decorative vessels, but also into the stained glass window art of the Middle Ages. And for those people who keep insisting that the Middle Ages was all brown and gray, well, yeah. It was largely that way for the peasantry, but for anyone who had any money, the stained glass windows of the Middle Ages reflect their color sense far more than any 21st century grayish movie set representing the Middle Ages. These people were all about mixing brights and jewel tones. Painted glass was also very popular, both painting on the outside and reverse painting, where paint was applied on the outside surface in reverse order, along with gilding with gold paint and creating cages of precious metals and stones. All of this decorative work went on with clear and translucent glass, some highly colored and some barely tinted. But as time went on, the central desire for many glassmakers was to come up with something as clear and strong as the rare, large rock crystals that were found and carved into fantastical, prized objects. As the scientific age developed and chemicals were identified systematically and scientific communication started to improve, it got easier to start testing out different additives and methods for making and working glass. And so the hunt for the most desired type of glass, clear glass, was made easier. Like glass, lead was another material that was popular in early manufactured items. Lead is relatively easy to pull from its rock ore due to its low melting temperature. It's easy to pound into shapes and is very resistant to corrosion, which is why it just hangs around. It also makes vibrant permanent colors, which is why it was popular as a white makeup and paint pigment. It also comes across as sweet to the human tongue, which is why little kids would eat lead paint chips. And Greek cooks would use lead pans to cook down grape syrup to sweeten the food of rich ancient Romans. See last week's episode on other sugars. Anyway, lead was ubiquitous and handy, so it's no wonder that lead oxides were used as an alternative to the calcium oxide in soda lime glass. The resulting material became generally known as lead crystal. And while it's truly a lead glass, the crystal name was used because it shared strength and weight and clarity properties with the dense and very rare rock crystal. But while rock crystal had to be mined and laboriously carved or hollowed out, hot lead crystal could be blown or molded into blanks that needed far less work than the quartz rocks. So while there wasn't quite clear glass decorative items for the masses, it was available for more people than just the crown princes with treasuries made up of the wealth of entire nations. By this time, we're getting to the 1600s, so glassmaking and pre-America get to meet. In fact, glassmaking was one of the industries Jamestown had hoped to develop. But as with farming and hunting and brewing as such, it turns out there's a lot of knowledge, skill, and practice that goes into making glass. From all the evidence that can be found, and there's quite a bit to look at, only a lump or two of proof of concept glass was made and sent back to England. The fact that things like laundry and basic food needs couldn't be met in early Jamestown meant that more esoteric pursuits like glass manufacture would have to wait. During this period, blown mold glass was a popular way to make bottles since it meant more decorative bottles for less work. But also, many of the glass objects were thick-walled to stand up to many repeated uses and shipments in actual ships through storms and thermal changes and whatnot. Out of blown glass, spun glass sheets were also being developed. This was a disc of glass manipulated a bit like a pizza crust, pulled thinner and thinner through spinning, though here on the end of a glass blowing pipe, and hopefully of similar thickness throughout. This had to be done with glass at a temperature that left it close to solid, so that when it was done there would always be a few ripples, and there would almost always be a few artifacts, bubbles and such, that would show that it came from a spun piece. Once cooled, these discs of spun glass would be cut into smaller shapes, around the worst irregularities, and made into multi-pane windows you can see even now in older structures. Over time, even larger plates of glass could be made by blowing large cylinders, cutting them open, and flattening them out. But these pieces were never clear. The flattening process always left them scratched and, yes, translucent. So while they were used to let light in, they were placed in places away from where people could get a good look at them. All the way through the end of the 1700s, glassmaking was still very laborious, and the prevailing technology meant there was no way to make anything bigger than what a single human could manipulate on the end of a long metal pole. The mechanical age was only in its infancy, so all the labor that went into glassmaking required largely direct human effort. Gathering the fuel, blowing up the furnaces, mining and transporting the sand along with the actual glass shaping. But the vast resources of pre- and baby America made it seem like the promised land for glass. The forests of the continent would provide the wood fuel and later coal. The wide, apparently uninhabited or at least unclaimed shores provided masses of sand, and the halophyte plants growing above the endless oyster beds provided all the soda anyone could want. And the oyster shells and local limestone deposits both provided adequate lime. All that, and more glassmakers from Europe were looking to make a new home away from the growing political upheavals of the time. As they emigrated to the new America, with their skills, it meant that by the 19th century, America had a thriving, if rather primitive, glass trade. Through the end of the 18th century, glass manufacture in Europe is far more skilled, and many more people have glass windows and objects in their homes. But with the emigration of glass workers and the rise of mechanization, the center of the glass world is going to shift, as is how glass is used. It will entirely change what homes look like and how manufacturing and food storage works. To finally get to glass in early 19th century America, you'll need to join me next time. We'll at last get into canning and why 19th century factories look the way they do. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there. But even better than that are your reviews. Reading them makes me very happy that people out there are enjoying the show and learning new things. You can join me for more food and more 19th century on my other podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. This time with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. It's much wilder and looser. Still food, but now with fashion and fighting and fraud and some other F's as well, which means F is for fun rather than E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Triddle, and you can find me out there on the internet generally as @THOA Food. All this information is available in the show description.